It's free applause. I'll take it when I can get it. So I'm really delighted you all joined us today. We obviously have a tremendous turnout, unexpectedly tremendous turnout when we planned the event. I've been sort of wondering, are we getting more popular? Is Washington popular? Is our program popular? This is what I think. I think we're a little more popular and growing with a bullet. I don't know anybody for whom Washington is more popular right now, so I'm going to discount that. I think probably it's the program is the lion's share of this is somewhere between double and triple the highest attendance we've ever had at a Silverchair Strategies conference. So thank you for coming. So how this event came about, and it's going to be quite different than events we've had in the past, for those of you who have come, is with the arrival of our new president this year, Tim Barton, and with his collaboration with the chief of our product organization, Jake Zarnagar. We sort of took a fresh look at what we were doing with our annual meeting. It's obviously a cliche to point out that technology is an ever increasingly important and crucial component of scholarly professional publishing landscape, and that the requirements are continually getting more complex and more variegated. And we sort of said, where's the forum to put it all together? We have publishing conferences that many of us attend that have a fraction of their program dedicated to technology-related issues. There are generalized technology conferences, but few of those touch on scholarly and professional publishing issues. And so we in the past have been very internally focused with this meeting, so focused on our roadmap and our publishers' products and that sort of thing. And we decided to take a very different view, and we think we can create and add a lot more value by broadening the approach. And so that's what we're going to try to do today and over the next 2 days. And by the way, our speakers, you'll obviously see, represent not just publishers or others who are involved with the Silverchair platform, but from our friends and competitors and other platforms as well. So the idea was to be very ecumenical about this and address the issues, not to have it be Silverchair focused. So we'll see how that works. We want to look at all the dimensions of technology that intersect with our publishing businesses so that we can align our investments and resources with the most likely trajectories going forward, the most important trajectories. As a side note, for those of you who are Silverchair publishers, we will develop in the first half of 2019 a more traditional, internally roadmap-focused, operationally focused meeting to meet those needs. But we thought for this, we'd really like to take it much wider and broader. So we've got a great program. I think that's probably why you're here. But we're going to talk about, I think, a host of really crucial and essential topics: digital product development in scholarly and professional publishing, interfaces of the future, particularly text and data mining. We've got some really stellar folks to talk about that. State-of-the-art, semantic smart content. How mobile access and mobile consumption is going to change. I think we've got a great speaker today. The CEO of one of the country's largest mobile app developers is going to join us. A friend of ours happened to also be based in Charlottesville, but now emerged as sort of a market leader in that space. It's going to be a great talk, and I think things are going to change in mobile. While we've been slower to adopt in scholarly than consumer, I think there's a lot coming that's going to change, so that should be fascinating. The discovery landscape, which is always evolving, always changing. As you know, we've got the absolute leaders in that space. Digital education. I think digital education is a space where as the primary literature businesses come under increasing pressure economically and from a business model, it's a bright spot. And there are a lot of things going on in professional development, continuing professional development, and we'll have a great panel on that. We're going to start with a panel about managing technology more broadly. So it'll be kind of the way that we jump in. And then our final panel is going to, I think, really be a special session. We've got some of the top leaders in our industry from both commercial and not-for-profit publishers having a sort of existential conversation about is there a place for not-for-profit publishing? How is scale changing not-for-profit publishing? What's the purpose of not-for-profit publishing? What are the advantages and disadvantages of the commercial and nonprofit modes? I think it's going to be Ann Michael will be moderating that, and she's obviously known to many or most of you. And we've had a great time with her leadership developing that session. So I go to a lot of conferences, as probably all of you do, and I know that ambivalent sensation that comes with an agenda that's 40% relevant, and then of that, half of it's going to be fluff for a week, and so then your 20% of the conference is worth it. That's not this meeting, I promise. I have been very personally involved in all of the session development. We have an incredible array of panelists. There isn't a weak link in the mix. It's going to be insight-packed. It's going to be thoughtful, relevant, and as we go along, as Stephanie mentioned, we'd like real-time engagement from you, asking questions through the app that is referenced in the program. And also, as we conclude, we'd really like your feedback and input to try to make this even better. So, without further ado, let's get started. I'm going to introduce to you our first moderator. Stewart Leach is the Chief Operating Officer at Silverchair. He's going to lead our panel of technology leaders from across the industry talking about managing enterprise publishing technology. Stewart?
All right, welcome everybody. As Thane introduced, I'm the Chief Operating Officer. Prior to this role, this is a relatively recent promotion, I was the Chief Technology Officer, so I'm actually a technologist at heart. So while I'm facilitating this panel today, I'll also actually be chiming in with my own introductory remarks and potentially adding some colour to some of the topics we discussed today. First of all, I'll introduce Max Gabriel. Max is the Chief Digital Officer at Taylor & Francis. And Max, your career has spanned multiple industries. I saw on LinkedIn Pearson, Ernst & Young, Pfizer, JP Morgan Chase. So you've just got a wealth of experience there.
Thank you.
And Max will be using his introductory remarks to talk about driving change in a technical context. Next up, we have Mark Doyle, and Mark is the Chief Information Officer at the American Physical Society. And Mark's background, you're actually trained as a physicist. So you're right in the sweet spot there, and you've been with the Physical Society for over 22 years, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct.
And Mark will be speaking to us about the complex challenges of internal software development in a changing external environment. And lastly, we have Jim King. And Jim is the Director of Publishing Technology for the American Chemical Society. And Jim's held many senior positions across the publishing industry, including the Washington Post.
Not popular right now.
All right, I shouldn't have said that. Jim's actually going to follow on from some remarks I'm going to make around kind of build versus buy versus partner, and kind of expound on this with the ACS philosophy and kind of share some of the pivotal decisions along the way of your journal's hosting platform. All right, can we change the slide? Let me change the slides over here really quickly. So how this session's going to work is that each of the speakers are going to, we're going to spend 5 to 12, 13 minutes just giving some introductory remarks. We recognise that as technologists, we're in our bubble, we have our concerns, and we really want to engage with you guys to essentially pull questions out of us. Like, we're all, more or less pretty seasoned technologists. What are the things that you want to understand about how we think about technology? So with that said, the way to participate is basically either stick up your hand, or better yet, text your answers to that number, and they will pop up on this screen here. And I've already got one, somebody's assertion, I found Jimmy Hoffa. So with that said, I'm going to pass this over to Max, who's got a great presentation for us about the nature of change.
Thank you, Stuart. Is this on? Great. Glad to be here when Thane and Stewart asked me to share some thoughts on platform strategy, I was very candid saying I don't have one. We have a platform dilemma, like most of you do. If anyone has figured it out, I would love to find out what your platform strategy is. But on a serious note, it allowed me to sort of reflect on our own journey from Taylor and Francis, as well as from the other industry. It gave me an opportunity to reflect, often obvious but often forgotten things in these change journey. So that's what I want to share with you, some high-level macro observations, sort of a warm-up act before the experts come in and share their real journey on what they've been on. Without further ado, I don't know how many of you know about Nostr model, which was introduced in the early 90s as a very good change management framework. Which basically, according to Nostr, there's about 5 components, and they all need to be in sync if you want an effective change. Vision, skills, incentives, resources, and a plan to execute. I don't know about you, I haven't come across a company that have all that sorted. So when you come to the real world where we operate in, we have bits and pieces missing, right? Which leads to either confusion when you don't have vision, or anxiety when you don't have the right skills to execute, or resistance when you don't have the right incentive models align, frustration when you don't have the right resources, whether it's investment or capacity. Finally, when you don't have an execution plan, you feel like you're making progress, but you're standing still, like the duck on the slide before. But what was interesting about it, it's increasingly becoming a leadership framework to look at change in a different way. That just feels like a Monday to Friday to me when I look at the number of programs we operate. Not everyone has figured out your vision, skills, and incentives and all of that. But it certainly helped me think about what was our journey, what was my journey looking back. So I call it the elusive change framework, or Gabriel's hindsight framework. When you look back on what did we miss in most of the change journey is, when you look at those things, it's blindingly obvious. Of course, context is important. Of course, culture is important. We do need to think about capabilities. We do need to look at complexity. But how often we give its due attention at the beginning of planning. So when I sort of look back to a series of decisions that were made and traced it back to why we did that, and it sort of boiled down to either was lack of clarity on the context on where we were starting. Sometimes the context where we started actually changes because of external factors that are around. That's an important one. We underestimate the power of culture. And I haven't been in meetings where people strategize about, well, what are we going to do about culture? We often misjudge the gravity of culture in companies when we look at, not in a negative connotation, but actually understanding what the true culture and spending some time thinking about it is really important. The other two will sound very familiar to many of you. Any project anyone had executed, we always overestimate what we can achieve. We always underestimate what's actually involved in that. So that's a very important and a common factor in any typical project. So sort of build on that. I'll just share some high-level observations on each one of those. Context is absolutely important because it's primarily driven by who is running the program, who is leading the program. Mainly because we don't necessarily see things the way they are. We see them the way we are. So it depends on who is driving it. If it's led by a digital specialist, if it's led by a technologist, or if it's led by a external consultant, whoever is leading it, they're going to set the context, which is okay as long as there's clarity around what that is and it's well understood. Often, this is interesting, when we set our platform journey, 3 years felt like a long time away. you know, everything seemed possible. You know, when you started, here's where we are, 3 years out, we can get that. But once you get into execution, when you hit the first milestone, you realize 3 years is right around the corner and you haven't gotten half of what you need to do. So the start state and the end state, you know, sounds pragmatic and it sounds realistic. We need to do it, but often we don't pay attention to the external factors that play in. So it's important to be conscious of those things. Point about culture is culture could be an anchor or it could be an accelerator, and I'm not here to advocate one or the other because, you know, culture is a reality. But it's really important for us to acknowledge it, in a way actually respect the culture, what it is. And what I've observed is if you're a newbie walking in, and I haven't been here long enough in publishing, you end up judging the culture. Or if you're an incumbent who spent 20 years in the industry, you also start judging the culture because you've been there long enough. But that's okay as long as you're having an open conversation about what it is and what are the impediments that's going to come in. What's buried inside a culture is leadership. And the leadership is this real empowerment, or is this, you know, setting up the team to go on a journey without creating the condition for success? Is it entrapment or real empowerment? And I think it's important for us to acknowledge what the cultural factors are. Something along the way I've observed, even talking to many peers, is there are cultures which are very happy to coexist in our functional silos. It's absolutely fine. And if it is, that's what we should acknowledge, right? Under the false pretense of we're collaborating, so, you know, we will get there jointly, sometime maybe misleading. Just acknowledge, is it a coexistence culture or is it truly co-ownership culture? Nobody's going to say they're not co-ownership, but it comes to life when there's a problem, right? When something goes wrong is when you know whether it's a co-ownership or absolutely coexistence culture. It was certainly a learning when you look back, you know, on some of the decisions we made on what sounded great at the kickoff meeting versus when something went wrong, you realize, you know, what the culture is. It's important to appreciate it. This is interesting. You know, I see a couple of chuckles here because, you know, Agile is one of this oversold product which sort of gives you the false sense that we are making progress. I'm not denying the merits of Agile, but, you know, taking the context and culture into account, we just need to be sure it's not about carving out a team and say, go do your post-it exercise in your conference room, and you realize when they want to come to the real world, they're bolted, you know, into the room and they can't really execute. So whoever is adopting it, you know, don't get misled saying we are agile, so we'll figure this out. Often we don't have the tough conversation at the beginning, and then we realize at the end of it, at the end of the journey. The third one is about capabilities. Capabilities is interesting because I've seen teams across the industry very good at resource management because there's a logic to it, there's a rationale to it. You can measure what is the capacity that's needed. But capability is tricky. It's tricky because it's forward investment. It's not spend, it's forward investment. How do you actually make commitment in terms of what would you need in the future and take a leap of faith and make that investment? It's hard, you know. And I don't have an answer to that. But it's actually important to acknowledge it and say, do we have the right capability? If we don't, there are multiple ways, and I'm actually keen to have an active discussion about, because there's no right answer about in-source, outsource, buy or build. It all varies by context. But having a deliberate conversation about what capabilities do we need. And when I mean capabilities, I'm talking about both from a platform standpoint as well as the people that are required to execute. You know, this is a known premise. You know, in the middle of the project, you acknowledge when you kick off the project, you obviously assemble a lot of familiar faces and say, you know, Jim and John and Charlie seem to know what they're doing, and you assemble a team to get started. But then you realize, what actually helped us get to this point is not necessarily going to, help you reinvent or re-engineer the future. It doesn't mean, you got to go implement a brand new team, but acknowledge the gaps that we have and make the commitment and create the space to invest in building the capability. I hear this a lot in terms of subject matter experts, that people know, and Thane made a remark about how much discoverability and discovery has changed and evolved over the decade. So, we could actually say, here's a great taxonomy specialist, and let's actually bring them in. Unless we create the space for them to become semantic, semantic enrichment experts, they're not necessarily going to be very helpful. So whether you're looking for external experts or internal experts, think about the right subjects before we align on subject matter experts. There's a very common way to think about capabilities, even when it comes to people. What is core for us? What is core for the business? What is real commodity? And what is truly competitive? It's a very standard way to think about it. But unfortunately, I don't think anyone gets excited about let's do all the commodity work. But unfortunately, in publishing industry, I'm generalizing here, there aren't enough commodity services that you can take it and use it on your platform, right? They are all vertical. There aren't enough horizontal capabilities that are interoperable. There are a few. So you are forced to spend your investment, your finite investment, in rebuilding a lot of the foundation, which you wouldn't normally like to do. So it's important for us to figure out, actually, as a request here, in terms of where there are opportunities to collaborate. I know Mark's team is doing a lot of work on open source. Where there are opportunities for us to collaborate. Not everyone have to reinvent the wheel when you're on a platform journey. This is personal learning. I'm sure many of you would agree. We focus a lot on skills, but especially if you're on a change journey, what is lacking in skills, if somebody makes up in their mindset, it goes a long way. And I certainly learned that the hard way. In terms of working with partners, I think there are more ways to work with partners than procuring their service or blindly outsourcing things as we used to. And I'm actually quite encouraged by, particularly conversation with Thane, some of the other partners. They're more open to co-innovating and doing investments, doing JVs and partnerships. So that's a creative way for us to explore in terms of sharing the risk, because especially when you're trying to do something new that hasn't been done before. The final one is in terms of complexity. Look, I can't emphasize this enough, because as a human nature to underestimate complexity, right? Doesn't matter whether you're optimist or pessimist. We like to look at things and we always underestimate complexity. And let's acknowledge that. It doesn't mean, if you remember the good old days of waterfall, where people say, well, let's just build buffer and contingency for that. That is not making up for understanding of complexity. And that actually shows, when you look around the industry, how many false starts we've had in terms of platforms. So building on that, this is just one view. Platform is pretty complex, often misunderstood as, it's a better looking website. There's a lot more that goes underneath. And I don't think individually we can tackle all of this. I don't think we should be tackling all of this. So if we actually figure out sort of a common definition of how these things need to work together, then we could actually, there's more opportunity for things to interoperate, even between publishers as well as partners, because that's just the right thing for the customers to do. Anytime you hear re-engineering, beware of that, because I don't think it's a coincidence, because it ends up being a perpetual, because it's re-engineering. There's no end state to it. What ends up happening is, within publishing particularly, there's a lot of focus on the content delivery and discovery part of it, but everything underneath, everything behind the scene is where the complexities lie. our value chain or supply chain on how we get the content out and how the business operates, they are pretty big impediments that we have. And we can't really afford to balance our investment behind it. So we end up saying we need to do a giant re-engineering of these programs. So just to build on that, so there are the quick wins and MVPs are actually, it's great to build momentum, but it actually masks the underlying complexity. You think about what you want to do and say, well, let's just plan our first milestone. It is MVP. I don't know who it's viable for. Definitely for the delivery team, but not necessarily for the customer, not necessarily for the person that's investing. But it's, this is where it's the fallacy, where we take a concept and try to implement it. I'm not saying don't. We absolutely need to build incremental milestone, but it tends to mask the complexity. And what ends up happening is, what happens? The team perpetually defers the more complex stuff to later because you want quick win, you want minimum viable, and it stays minimum viable for a long time. Last one, I don't know about you, I haven't seen human-to-human knowledge transfer necessarily work, even within the same company. So particularly when you're trying to figure out complexity of things, knowledge transfer has failed me more than actually helped me. If you're like us or any other publishers, there are a lot of heroes behind the scene that are doing heroic stuff to hide the complexity, which is not visible, when you're doing platform build. But unfortunately, they don't scale, and you don't want to try and automate those heroic efforts. It's actually an opportunity for you to say, how can we get rid of some of those stuff and rethink some of this. This is my view, personal view, in terms of, it's actually a bit controversial because throughout my career, I was a believer in workflows and business process automation. It's actually, I'm starting to wonder in terms of, that's actually what has gotten us here, because the business process automation is inherently designed to automate what you do internal to the company, right? They are functional silos of departments, and how do you make sure things work across departments? And we try to keep automating that, as opposed to there's an opportunity to start from the user experience and drive it backwards, and not necessarily try to automate all these suboptimal processes that were not necessarily meant for a proper digital-first platform that we're supposed to do. Probably took a little longer than I should have, but just to summarize, have clarity of the context, appreciation, genuine appreciation for the culture, knowing what it is and keep checking on has certainly helped. And alignment of capabilities. I don't think this will ever be done, but having a view on where we are and are we trending the right way absolutely helps. And then complexity is not that we would ever have a full handle on the complexity, but you can actually make some choices on upfront, saying, these are things I'm not going to address, and live with it. And then there are other areas where you may choose to address. With that, I'm open for questions. Thank you.
All right, Mark, you're up.
All right, great. So first, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity, Silverchair, for being able to participate in this. And also thank you to Max for that great high-level overview thing with all of the different themes and stuff, which hopefully I'll try and be able to connect some things to. Definitely relate to anxiety, things like that. But as Stewart said in his introduction, I'm not a traditional IT person. I don't come from an IT background. When I first got the invite here, the description included an acronym like LTCO, which I actually had to Google to figure out what that meant. It's something about long-term costs. So I don't think in those terms. I do, like Max mentioned, thinking from the user experience and working in. Owning, for us, let me step back and just explain the APS. So it's the American Physical Society, it's physics. We have an editorial office that's located on the eastern end of Long Island because historically we've been associated with Brookhaven National Lab and exist in the past. And we are, I think different than a lot of organizations in some ways. We're a not-for-profit, so I'm really looking forward to that last session that Thane mentioned to learn what our fate is going to be. But it rings true, the struggles of sort of a nonprofit in a changing environment, and that's some of what I want to talk about. But what makes us somewhat unique is that we have a very large in-house editorial staff, which kind of owns a lot of or think they own a lot of the aspects of the journals and everything, and certainly they own the peer review component is by far the most significant thing, and our journals are very well embedded in the community, and that's a feature that we strive very hard to preserve. What that means, though, is that there's a strong internal voice for things, and so where those dividing lines are, we're also not a traditional IT department in that we're just not a service organization. In fact, the department that services the journals is really called Journal Information Systems because it's really taking a more systems type approach than just servicing requests from the outside and things like that. And one of the advantages, one of the things I really like about APS is that we have a relatively flat organizational structure, and we're also able to use technology to our advantage to get involved with the larger currents within scholarly communications and things, and actually influence more than you would think just based on our size, the developments going forward. So to the extent that owning our own technology and being able to put new ideas out there or participate in working groups and other efforts that are cutting across the industry is something that I think is a really important facet of what we do with my team. I've been fortunate that I've been able, as Stewart said, I've been with the APS for over 20 years, and so I've been able to build IT teams from within. Some of the changes that have happened over time is the things we used to worry about, or the costs that we used to worry about have really been driven away in a large degree. Storage costs, for instance, have plummeted. Worrying about what version of FreeBSD and whether the BIOS driver works correctly or not for whatever we have is just something we haven't thought about in 15 years, but we used to think about. Now it's all thinking about what technologies on AWS are we doing? Are we able to scale? And all of those kinds of things. So really what's happened is, and Max talked a little bit about scaling. Are we able to scale our solutions? Are we able to respond to changes in the business environment? It's very different now. 15, 20 years ago, all the effort was focused on, let's just turn out the next issue of the journal. We're done, that's it. Well, then we start the next issue. But it's not that anymore. We live in a world where open access is pushing text and data mining, new ways of accessing content, making sure discoverability was mentioned. The one-liner for describing my job to my family is when you Google Einstein, our results show up top of the list is my job. I'm happy to see Anurag here because he uses that as a test case, he told me last night. But what are the different things that we have to face? Building the right team is really the recipe that's there, and that's not a repeatable thing necessarily. There's no guarantee that you're able to do that. And when I talked about being able to save costs and things, what that's enabled us really to do is invest in the people that we have. So I've been fortunate to be able to create an environment that retains people who enjoy working within our organization, and in doing so, it's also meaning being willing to embrace the cutting edge of technology in a lot of ways. Max mentioned that we use a lot of open source software. In fact, we almost use universally, there are very few things that we actually license. Everything is open source. We try and contribute back. We're not using open source systems necessarily, but we're building our own systems. In the past, we've been on different journal platforms in the early days of online publishing, and in parallel, as sort of a safety thing, we also built our own platform for our archival content. Back in the late 90s, we were one of the first publishers to put our entire back file online, for instance, and that was always a hedge for us. And what we realized was that it was actually advantageous for us at the time to actually pull our current production in and put it onto our own journal platform. So we've had our own internal peer review system, manuscript tracking, whatever you want to call it, system since the 1970s. I'll talk about that a little bit more. We've also have our own journal platform since that's really for current publishing since 2010. And having those two things in-house has also enabled us to do a lot of things, and we can actually iterate on some things very quickly. So for instance, I'll give you an example. So I'm one of the co-chairs of the Chorus Technical Working Group, which is an effort to make it easy for authors to comply with the funding, the mandates that come out of the funders, mostly of the US research funding agencies. And it's based around public accessibility of things like manuscripts and things like that. Well, that kind of thing, being able to pull the manuscripts into our platform and make it available and change the rules and the visibility to Google so that they don't accidentally get indexed and things like that, is something that can take us literally a week to do. And so we're able to iterate on things like that extremely well. One of the motivations for bringing our journal platform in-house was the fact that we were actually able to tie that into the peer review system to make sure that some common errors that were happening in the publications were actually caught during the QC stage that were very hard to do when we didn't have that tight integration and everything. So for instance, is the type of article actually correct? Are the authors correct? And all of those kinds of things. And but about that peer review system, right? So it actually goes back to the 1970s. We had computerized stuff. We have a referee database that goes back that far. The manuscripts go back that far. We have a command line environment still for our editors that uses C programs that date from the 1970s. I'm working hard to kill it off by the end of this year, actually. But that's the kind of technical debt that you instill. And the other thing with that peer review system is it's grown, the online version of it, to move away from a paper-based system really is about 15 years old. And what that means is it's grown organically. We have, like I said, we have this strong internal voice doing things. Each journal wants to do something a little different and all of that. And we built flexibility in, but it comes at a cost where the system becomes so complex or interrelated that introducing relatively simple things can actually become very complex. And we've actually reached the point where the technical debt is really putting us at a fork in the road, right? Mm-hmm. Do we re-engineer? Culturally, people want to own that system internally, right? There are all these kinds of things that you start talking about, looking at third-party systems, and the anxiety starts going, and all of those kinds of things. But we really have to think carefully about what it is. How do we use that to adapt to the new business models of open access, or change the business model perhaps around the ratio of in-house to remote editors and editorial boards and things like that. Again, it's built from the in-house editor point of view, so the cognoscenti who use it every day, day in, day out, are experts in the use of that system, but you get these occasional remote editors who are part-time, come in a couple of times a week, maybe handle a handful of papers, who are faced with a rather daunting user experience, right? So they do get trained, but it's hard, and those are the issues that sort of really take up our time, figuring out how to navigate through that. So one of the things was like, when do you go and look for outside help in these kinds of things? And as I said, we've built in a lot of in-house opportunities, so we haven't yet really done that, but there are things like looking at capabilities, and so team augmentation to come in. When we first started building our peer review thing, we did not have the right skill set for the technology that we really wanted to use. That technology is now, I won't say what it is, but it's long in the tooth and is definitely, but it still works. But we had to bring in outside people to build components and teach us alongside of us in order to do that and build up that in-house skill set. So that's one strategy. Another one is, I would say we have weaknesses in like front-end web development and design, and so we often will work with outside design firms to build that front end for us. And they don't have to build the whole thing, but they can deliver enough components that here's the template for us to build on, and we're able to iterate from there. And a third one is dealing with this internal culture, right? Sometimes the messenger from outside is a better thing than listening to me saying, hey, we have to change our ways, right? We really want to bring in somebody from the outside and sort of guide that conversation to make it a level playing field and make people really feel that they're being listened to and things like that. And so that's another instance. The things that keep me up at night are, like I said, we've been able to build as teams. So we have some very particular people who I keep chained to their desk, and I don't mention their names in public so they don't get poached. But basically, no, I'm kidding. I have very good team members. Yeah, yeah. So I've invested in them, but you never know what's going to happen, right? So you become very reliant on individuals, and that's not necessarily the best place to be. On the other hand, it serves us very well in the current thing, and so deciding what the right long-term strategy is for that is something that that's one of the things that sort of keeps me up at night. So we also, like I said, tend to use a lot of cutting-edge technologies. You may have noticed those things are in demand. You know, you mentioned machine learning, and it's like, well, they're all running off doing these things, other things, and but even just the modern web development technologies and things like that, it's very hard to hire the skills and things. We're lucky being far enough on Eastern Long Island, even though we sort of compete with the New York market, there are people who, believe it or not, who actually don't want to commute into the city 2 hours a day, and actually that can help us often attract people, and that's been a benefit, but we can't always count on that. And so I don't want to go on too long because I think everybody will have questions, but those are some of the challenges, some of the things that go into the thinking. The thing is, one last point is, I mentioned, peer review manuscript tracking system. We have our own submission system. Who in the room actually gets fan mail about their submission system? So I'm actually going to raise my hand. People write in and say, thank you, that was a really great experience. And so owning that customer experience. Now you can say, one of the things is you have to look at was what value do we add, right? Are you really adding that much value over the cookie cutter thing? But as I said, we're community-based journals, and we're always thinking about our user base. We hate the term customer, so we think about our authors and our referees, and what is their experience, and are we really wasting their time, or are we giving them the most efficient thing to get their work into our paper, into our system, so that we can carry out the essential work that we do, which is peer review, and then making their papers published and everything. So owning that customer experience is something that we really think carefully about, and it's the same with the journal platform as well. And I can certainly talk more about it if there's interest, but I'm gonna stop there.
Well, Mark, thank you very much. I think you've actually anticipated a lot of the questions. So I'm going to speak next, and Silverchair is primarily a software company. We, are obviously in the publishing industry, but first and foremost, we're an engineering organization. But the challenges that we actually face in many respects are the same challenges that you all have. And by the way, how's the volume? I did get a note that we're having some problems with volume. Can everybody hear? Yeah, okay, great. So what I'm going to talk about today is essentially the build-buy kind of partner dilemma. In some respects, there are situations where this is like really straightforward. It's an obvious answer. But if you're spending significant executive time on it, it's often a pretty nuanced conversation that doesn't have clear outcomes with it. And you actually have to reflect pretty deeply, and kind of this is connecting into some of the things that were said earlier about, what is your culture and what are your cultural biases? And what I'm going to share today is just kind of a framework of some of the questions that we ask ourselves internally, kind of prompting questions that help us kind of get real about what are the mistakes that we've learned from in the past and where do we tend to go. So as a software company, we, particularly our engineers, and we have several of them here in this room, they are exceptionally clear that given an infinite budget, unlimited time, they can outbuild everybody. The challenge is that we often actually end up overspending on technology for a sense of control that we feel we really need to have. And what happens is that over time, complexity accretes, and we have to continue to look in the mirror and say, are we actually really willing to continue to carry the cost of this complexity? So we've actually had a few build then buy kind of outcomes. The questions we ask ourselves here are like, is this fundamental to our business? Does this actually add real differentiation? Are our needs actually significantly different from what the cookie cutter solutions offer. Market maturity is a really big one to think about. Like a more mature market is going to tend to be more competitively priced. It's going to have a lot more feature richness there. You've usually got best practices cooked in. You've had the weaker players winnowed out. The next one, complexity, is, and both of our, Max and Mark alluded to this, this is a huge one. And this is really about, for me, it's about the long-term cost of ownership. This is the acronym Mark was referring to. And this is kind of when you look at kind of studies of software, they estimate that about 70% of the life cycle costs of building software are incurred after the initial features are written. So as you think about building those features out, you've got this long tail of maintenance cost. So we have to really look hard into the mirror and ask ourselves the question, if we're really feeling like we need to take on a huge amount of complexity, can we actually support the long-term tail of cost there? Like, do we actually have the economies of scale here? Capability is really about saying, do we have the right people in the building, both from a technical perspective, but also do we actually have the domain experience? And this is one where you want to be honest with yourself as well, because we're really in a knowledge working space. And so there's a certain amount of learning that you're going to do. And we all know that after you've done something in a knowledge working space, it's usually like half the cost to just turn around and immediately go and do that same thing. And you're wanting to think about, what is our learning journey through this likely to be and how expensive is it, versus essentially partnering with somebody that's already done this. And then the last one, and this to me is actually the most decisive one. This is I view attention is really the spice of life. And this is not about technology per se. This is really that whatever you actually bring your focus to in life, that's what flowers. The challenge is that we over-allocate our focus and we actually generate fragmentation. And to kind of carry that analogy forward, what do you end up with?
Weeds.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you end up with a garden of pretty mangy-looking flowers that are exceptionally expensive. We have a couple of examples that I'll share about our journey. And in hindsight, you can look at these things and say, oh, well, geez, that was the wrong choice. They actually weren't necessarily the wrong choice at the time. But as time went on, those decisions didn't age very well. So one of the earlier decisions we made was around search. So we have a very strong semantic capability within Silverchair. And when we were building the platform, we were looking at this and saying, well, this is actually mission critical for us to have an exceptionally fine-grained level of control over the search experience. And clearly search is, extraordinarily important to all platforms. It's really about discovery and, surfacing content and, having researchers be able to very efficiently find their way both through targeted search, but also through sideways kind of relationships. So we went and actually rolled our own search engine. And this is, beginning of the decade, so it's not like today. We built that up with primitives based on, the Windows stack. And we had a lot of theoretical complexity there. What we ended up starting to run up against was, as Mark was alluding to, kind of the technical debt. And what we found was the complexity of that space in and of itself was massively constraining for us. And what we had to confront was that we actually didn't have the economies of scale to carry that level of complexity. And so we actually stepped back and really assessed what would it be to actually, rather than building this on primitives where you have an extraordinary amount of control, what would it be if we adopted essentially a stack that was already built and operated at a much higher level of abstraction? And in our case, we adopted Solar, which is based on the Lucene engine. And that's pretty common open source. And this is like a lot of these technology trade-offs, that you go from something that you can essentially control your entire destiny to operating on top of an abstraction, and all abstractions are leaky. They kind of have a happy path, they have things that they do really well. but then you also end up fighting that abstraction. We ultimately, in this process, at that point didn't have a lot of experience with solar, so we actually brought in some outside partners to really help us ramp up and really see around the corners there. We did focus in on transferring that knowledge, and that's actually one of the few experiences internally where it actually did work out reasonably well. Like Neil's one of the folks that really absorbed a lot of that knowledge, and we now have a really strong internal solar capability there. But this was an example where we didn't per se buy solar, but we did have this kind of build then buy kind of transition. Another one that we had was, we are, as an engineering organization, we do tend to veer towards maximum control. It's just one of our inherent kind of cultural biases. And in terms of, our production environment, like clearly it's really, really important that we be able to control all aspects of that. And so we basically, spent a lot of money building out equipment that gave us the ability to control every little thing and be able to have monitor points at all different places within that. And that actually, that gave us enormous power and great flexibility. And we've actually been able to use that flexibility to do some pretty crazy things for some of our clients. But we've also found that it's very expensive. It's not just expensive in terms of the cost of the hardware. The real hidden cost is the cost of continuing to have the knowledge within the organization. Complex systems take a lot to maintain in terms of people. And what really pushed our thinking here was the commoditization of cloud hardware or cloud services, as we've just seen kind of the whole economics of that start to get inverted. And what we started to realize was that as a company of our size, we were starting to see large players emerge that really had economies of scale and that could actually do this very well. So this caused us to look in the mirror and ask ourselves the question, where is all this going? And how much control do we have to let go of? And how much control could we let go of? And what would be available if we gave up some of that control? And the big thing that we confronted here was there's kind of two main flavors of cloud things that are out there. There's what's called infrastructure as a service and then platform as a service. And most companies are doing infrastructure as a service, and that's basically where you get, you provision with AWS, for example, a virtual environment that you install an operating system on top of. And for those of you that are more technically inclined, if you've got control of the operating system, you can do some pretty crazy stuff. You've got a huge amount of flexibility, and you can basically, you do all the wire up yourself between the servers. Platform as a service, on the other hand, is kind of a much higher level of abstraction where you no longer get access to the operating system. It's essentially like wearing a straitjacket. It's very constrained in what you can do. It's very opinionated. But in exchange for no longer controlling the operating system, you actually are freed of the complexity there. It actually forces a simplification. And one of the things that was really appealing for us is, in this day and age, security is just like, it's just a tax on everybody. And we really think about what's the surface area that we're actually maintaining, because you maintain operating systems, you have to have in-house experts that know how to harden these servers, know how to monitor them. There's just a massive amount of overhead with that. Whereas in a platform as a service environment, we're actually able to transfer that risk to Microsoft, who is arguably the best in the world at securing Windows. And so we actually went through this journey, and we actually went from essentially one extreme to another, where we were actually willing to give up huge amounts of control, operate in that very constrained environment. And what we actually found was that, and we now have virtually almost all of our cloud components now are hosted within Platform as a Service. What we've found is that we have to think very hard up front about the trade-offs, essentially about how this thing is designed to work, and essentially get ourselves aligned with that. But then that we actually have picked up so much velocity that we're getting better outcomes because we're not having to manage that same degree of complexity. So I'd kind of summarize this by saying that you know, I've been speaking here to some of Silverchair's biases, but you want to think about what are the biases you have within your organization, because they're the things that you really need to highlight. All right, and so I'm going to pass this on to Jim, who's going to follow on from this.
You know, being the last guy to speak, it kind of narrows the space you can speak to, which is good, because I really don't want to talk for a long time. But following on what Stewart said, and to some degree Max and Mark, we faced a lot of those questions of should we buy or build when I first came to ACS. I'm going to have to admit here that I'm a bit schizophrenic about this. The technologist in me wants to build everything, because as Stewart said, I know I'm better than anybody else. The guy has to come in on budget, add value, and come in on time. Things a little different about it. You know, I actually have to add value in a short period of time on budget. So, and we started looking at it about 10 years ago. We started looking at a delivery platform. I'll just use this as one example. We did it across the board, but I'll use the delivery platform. We'd come to the realization that we had to replace the system we had. And we started doing the analysis of build first part. I'll call it partner as opposed to buy. And it was a difficult discussion, because at that time, a lot of the people who would partner, although I wouldn't say it was a partner, was, you know, buy it from us and run it, because you don't get to have any say. It was
People having difficulty here.
they really didn't offer everything we wanted from the standpoint of what we were capable, you know, what capabilities we said we wanted, or the capabilities that we thought we could do better. And one of the questions that we really had to ask ourselves was take an honest look at our bias of how much of what we do is really competitive and how much is table stakes. Yeah, if you want to be in business, you do this, and so does everybody else in your industry. Do you really have to build that? And so what you focus on is looking at where the competitive advantage is. And it's really a small percentage of what we do. I mean, any one of our shops pretty much, I would say 70, 80% of what we do is the same. It's a very small piece that's competitive advantage. So what we ended up doing when we realized that how expensive it was going to be to build our own was to really start tearing that analysis apart and see where we go. What was going to give us what we needed to be different than our competitors? Not what was going to, we had to build to be like our competitors. That you buy. It's simple. Let you guys, Silverchair, Adapons, all those people actually be competitive in that space. You're competing with each other. I'm not. You know, I don't compete with the Royal Society of Chemistry, and 80% of the stuff we do. On the business side, it's total competition, but not on the not on technology.
Can you speak up? People are having difficulty hearing you.
Okay. Let's see if I can get this. That better? Is anything?
Give you this.
So we started really analyzing that. And like most people, we all want to think we're unique, when in fact, most of our lives we're not very unique at all. It was a hard decision because we had to sit back and say, no, you know, the look and feel of the website's not really what's competitive. The ability to get content out quickly onto the website once we're gone through productions, not competitive. That's table stakes. So we started looking at areas. One area, for example, we looked at was analytics. We ended up deciding to go with Adapon as our partner at that time. And their analytics were very good for the customer facing, not their customer, my customer, for the libraries. They were not good for internal use. So we had to figure a way to do that. That was something they weren't going to offer. There's a couple other areas, but I'll just focus on this one. What we ended up deciding to do was sort of a hybrid, the platform or operating system as a service. And we ended up deciding to take the platform and run it on our servers, because we could then get access to the databases, and we engineered a way to get the information we needed, basically the database logs, to be able to do the analytics we needed, and then merge that with the rest of our analytics. That would have been difficult. Well, wouldn't have, that amount of work that we did to do that would have been dwarfed by the work it would have been to build what was non-competitive. So we went that direction. A couple things have changed as we go forward 10 years. And that is the partners started becoming real partners and not just software, not just selling software to us. And the landscape changed drastically. We made some bad decisions. We decided we wanted Oracle as our database as opposed to SQL, which Adapon was using, and that caused us some problems. But all in all, we had it working pretty well. We came up into the, about a year or so ago, we decided it was time to revive our website. So we started that project, and at that point we said, let's revisit the whole idea of just becoming a platform as a service. And the two factors that really changed there was the partner, Adapon, among all the other partners, grew up. They actually gave you the ability to work with them, to partner with them. And also, the areas like their analytics, they started giving you access to the database, which they hadn't been doing. So we decided at that point, we're just going to move over to this is our website, you handle it, and we'll work with you to improve your platform. I think that's a big part of deciding to make that decision. And in our case, it was the acknowledgement of everything in that platform was not competitive. Why bother? Let somebody else do it. You guys do it, just like you did with your infrastructure. We did it with the platform. The other piece I want to move into very briefly is culture, because I think that's the most important thing that we are facing right now. I used to worry about cost of ownership and life of systems. I don't worry much about that anymore, because they're not going to live very long anyway. You know, the fact is the world is changing very quickly. We've been slow to adapt. If we continue to be slow to adapt, we won't exist. Other people are going to get into our business and they're going to clean our clocks. So I worry now about flexibilities of systems. Building and taking on the technical debt locks you into something, where partnering allows you to just jettison the partner if you need to, or pressure them to stay competitive, to be flexible. So we, at this point, my opinion has changed completely, and even the technologist in me is acknowledging that I can't beat everybody. Other piece is again, the cultural change. I think we have to adapt the flexibility of a Google or something else that failure is not a bad thing. You just don't want to spend a lot of money failing. Like a lot of you, I believe like a lot of you, it's hard to get money for R&D. It's easier to get money and sneak R&D into projects. You know, we're going to go ahead and pretend we're doing a proof of concept. It's not a proof of concept. I'm seeing if this damn thing works in the first place. You got to have a culture to have some money put aside where you can go in and fail very quickly, not lose a lot of money, and separate that from running the business. We don't do that. For the first time in the last 2 years, ACS has accepted the fact that that works. I've been very lucky that I've had a couple staff members who they do this stuff in their leisure time. They like doing it. They're engineers. You got to keep the engineers around for that reason. I got one guy Monday morning, his office is next to mine. First thing Monday morning, he comes in and shows me what he's been working on the weekend. Sometimes it has something to do with publishing, but a lot of times it's, you know what I did in my house this weekend. Areas like AI, we've taken some leaps because of his weekend, leisure time. We are now putting that into our process. We're carving out time, carving out money. Companies don't like doing that, and that's a cultural shift. And if you got to separate your tolerance for failure in your R&D realm from the implementation of product realm. If you fail 60% of the time, 70% of the time in R&D, you're probably doing a good job. If you fail 70% of the time in implementation, you're unemployed. So you have to shift that culture and make sure that people realize there are two different worlds. And we don't move fast. I come out of the newspaper industry where in about 1993, 94, I was flying around the world figuring out the best electronics, best technology in printing presses. Post was investing $250 million in printing and another $50 million in new plants. In 1998, they were selling the printing presses and they were tearing down the plants. The world changed, and they didn't change. We have to change. And again, my fear of what's shifted my thinking on build and buy and in culture is that I don't care about the technical debt. I care about the ability to bring in new technology or modifying the technology cheaply because it's flexible.
Thank you. Jim, why don't you hang on to that so that you can use that when you respond to questions? Yeah, just hang on to that. All right, well, thank you very much. We have actually got a great number of questions here, which is actually really helpful. I was kind of busy taking notes to be a good moderator here, but you've done my job for me. Number of questions here. Question for Jim. Exactly what kind of analytics were you trying to run on your own platform? Like what questions were you trying to answer that you weren't seeing answers to originally?
Well, as I say, internal analytics. We were trying to see usage patterns. We were trying to see how people moved around the websites and where they were coming from. Obviously, with the IP authentication, you really can't tell who the people are, but you can tell the trends that are happening. What universities, what geographical areas are people coming to your site, and what does that mean to your business planning? At the same time, we were starting to look a lot at our customer analytics, and as a society, we were looking at our membership analytics. One, Adapon did not offer at that time the internal to the extent that we wanted it. They offered what the librarians needed, and their focus was librarians. Two, they had nothing to do with the other analytics. So while we were looking mostly at usage from Adapon, we needed the ability to merge that into a bigger analytics application that merged all of our data so we could make our decisions can be made not in isolation for the website, but for the business and how to run the business.
Great. I've got a question here for Max. So Max, in the change framework, you had the 4 quadrants, context, clarity, complexity, and culture. And the question is there one or two of these that are more important to you than others?
For me, or can you guys hear me? No, I think they're all important. In any change, the point about capabilities and complexity, we just deal with this day in and day out. You don't have a choice not to deal with them. The culture point, as Mark and Jim mentioned, we often don't spend enough time thinking that through. For me, of all those things where there could be impediments or there could be enablers, what's the most critical thing that's actually sets up the condition for success is really the capabilities, where, as Mark was saying, do we have the right team? And our strategy to assemble a small internal team wasn't about control, because I personally made enough mistakes thinking that you want control and you can do it better, and I actually learned that having an internal team gives you some deep learning that's incredibly valuable than doing it all yourself. So having the right capability, assembling the right team, retaining them is what keeps me in the know.
Great. I've got 2 logistical questions that have come in. One is a suggestion that folks that are standing on the wall, if you don't want to stand, there actually are some seats in here so you can move around. And the second is, I've had this question asked 3 times now, which is, can we have access to the slides? So Max, these are primarily your slides. Are you comfortable sharing them?
I'm happy, yeah.
Great, okay, so slides will be available. Stephanie will make that kind of magic happen. We have, let me see, GDPR. How is everyone dealing with GDPR/security as an independent platform in terms of the cost of ownership?
I guess I can
Conundrum.
answer that. So that's a complicated one. I think it's really changed. Well, one thing that is changed is definitely our marketing kind of approach to things, right? Just being able to email. On the journal side, 2/3 of our authors and subscribers and everything are outside of the United States, whereas on the society side, it's more like 2/3 are in the United States. So there are differences there. But to tell you the truth, we really did not build up huge, accumulations of data and things. Although we do have the logs and also the, as I said, we have this editorial database that goes back, decades. And we do retain all of that information. However, that information is all part of a business thing. It's been collected, so we don't really market around that and things like that. From a security perspective, again, we have a very tight security footprint. And our biggest challenge is actually working with outside people to make sure that when we transmit data to them, they're able to comply with GDPR. So a lot of the work has been focused on making sure that all of our various vendors for production or whatever are actually able to adhere to the things, especially about data breaches and the notification terms and things like that. We don't, things like cookies and websites and all of that, we've always built our websites in a way that you can turn all of that off and the user experience will basically be the same. And so you can only, if you want, you can opt in. So we really didn't have to make very many changes for that. A lot of it was we already had a philosophy of privacy and data protection, and so it was more about changing our public statements around those kinds of things than actually implementing technical changes. I also happen to think that we're in a pretty low risk in terms of what the intention of GDPR is, in terms of what the target for that. The penalties in GDPR are substantial. I just think that one of the things we look at is how much additional work do we do. I think that's saying, let me be very clear, we're compliant, we can comply with anything, but we don't need to go way out of our way because we're worried about these 2% of annual revenue type penalties and things like that, because I actually don't think we're a target audience for those kinds of penalties.
Could I just throw it back to the audience in terms of how many of you think this is a good thing? Put your hand up. GDPR.
Privacy in general?
GDPR. Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a good thing. Well, what's interesting, we've been having these discussions, and usually when somebody asks, what are you doing about it, there's actually an awkward pause for some time. So at least it's consistent here. When we're talking to some legal experts, somebody said it beautifully, because that's the beauty of regulation, right? By the time, the intent is great. By the time you're going to publish it somewhere, so by the time you catch up to it and implement it, and the world has moved on, I think it was really geared towards a desktop world, is what the regulation's intent behind it was. And by the time they got to the implementation, the world has moved on quite a bit. So there's a lot of gray areas in terms of how does it apply for B2B, how does it apply for a pervasive mobile usage and all of that. Now, everyone, either companies are skeptical about it and others have sort of overdone in terms of checks and balances. But as a consumer, when I look at it on the other side, you have those disclaimers come in. I don't know how many of you actually go through it and really giving consent, right? You want to get rid of it and get to the content. So, it was a good intent behind it, but in terms of, implementation, in terms of are we really, addressing the root cause behind the privacy issues, I'm not so sure, right? In general terms. But I think it's certainly woken up a debate within the marketing departments saying, we used to do this, should we be doing this? And that's a good thing, right? That's a healthy conversation to be had. So the answer is not sort of overreacting it, but as a consumer, every website I go into, there's a consent that comes up where you want to dismiss it and get on with your life. Unfortunately, that's the implementation of GDPR where we are.
Great, I've got another couple of logistical questions here. They're all the same one, which is basically, I think it's talking about the disconnect of kind of the human interaction here where everything's being done, over the phones. So we've actually got some microphones if anybody actually wants to, Brian's got one there, if anybody actually wants to ask a question live and have that human-to-human interaction, that would be great. But we do have plenty of questions that keep rolling in here. So Max, a specific question for you. Does having the expectations to make a certain amount of money based on historical income and shareholders make the transition plans needed more difficult or easier?
Okay, who asked this question? I need to meet this person. I would like a bit more clarification on this. Could you repeat the second half?
I can give you their phone number.
You do have the phone number. It is GDPR compliant, of course.
Does having the expectations to make a certain amount of money based on historical income and shareholders make the transition plans needed more difficult or easier?
Yeah. Well, I think the short answer is, of course it makes it harder. Most of us where we are, it's not just unique for publishing, but the past success of a model that has worked is actually the main driver which holds you back, right? It creates behavior to continue to protect it. Completely ignoring everything else around you is changing. And if you're going to do that, you can't continue to deliver the profit pool that you did. Of course, it makes it harder. And that makes it, the chief executive job a critical one in terms of navigating, in terms of managing the present as well as, if that's all you did, you're going to be stuck. And the same shareholders are going to say, well, what about your future? And if you don't sneak in the R&D and try to create the future, then you have that dilemma. So it absolutely makes it harder. There are a lot more I could definitely talk about shareholder expectation these days. It's incredible. Apple continue to post great profit and revenue, and then people still talk about iPhone sales seems down, right? So the shareholder expectation on one end, even us as consumers, right, on the other side, it is sort of misplaced. In a changing environment, I think we genuinely need to take a long-term view around many of these things, and it is the responsibility of the management team to help navigate both ends.
Great. We have two related questions here, and I'll read them both out and then we can kind of respond to them. How do you lead an organization into an honest assessment of what is commodity and what is competitive? What types of folks or departments are harder to engage? And the related question is, can you speak to your relationship with product management in determining what's competitive? Do you always agree?
I don't think you always agree. That's a given, I think. But I think all areas are resistant to do that. Everyone wants to believe they're unique. So I think it has to come from the top saying, until we work this out and we come to some agreement, some consensus, then we're not moving forward. And you kind of keep people's feet to the fire. You have to challenge everything, because we always bucket things and say, well, I'll look at everything except this piece. And everything has to be on the table. So it's difficult.
Yeah, it is difficult. This is one that I've kind of struggled with myself, and the answer that I've kind of come up with is actually to try and really model behavior, particularly within the span of the organization I actually control, is to really try and build in the behaviors such that people realize that what I value is kind of the intellectual honesty, the ability to really unpack something and really to locate oneself in the conversation. and to continue to reinforce that it's actually a safe space to do that and that we actually expect this. We want to be able to sacrifice sacred cows if indeed their time is up.
Yeah, I think I already mentioned the culture of like having the internal staff and all of that, and the you know, so it's interesting. Jim's made that transition to we don't need to. We can push the platform out, and we don't need to worry about that. Where I'm still, I guess, the immature one, which holds tightly to a lot of different things. But a lot of that is, So, but like I said, we're seriously thinking about this, especially when we think about our peer review system. But what kind of department? So, editorial is by nature a conservative thing, right? They're trying to conserve a scholarly record. It's a kind of an attitudinal component, just as part of their makeup by nature. And so one of the hardest conversations is, and again, we used to be, when developing the system, or even our own journal platform, there was a lot of opportunity for internal people to participate and help shape what it was going to look like, as well as working with outside, customers, for lack of a better word. And they got used to that, right? But then there's a shift, right? You have something like an open access thing coming from this direction, or you have the need to be able to be competitive in another direction. And I would say the mode over the last 3 to 5 years has really been shifting to be responsive more to external market pressures than things that arise from internally. And that cultural shift is extremely difficult to make. And when you go back to them and say, well, yes, you really would like to, I understand you really would like to have this new feature, but can you articulate how this will actually improve, say, the outcomes of the peer review process? Well, I don't know, I just know that I need to have this extra information in the database. And just because it's there, I mentioned this command line environment, a lot of that is because our editors will spend lots of time pulling together data and doing all sorts of things, but it's hard to measure just how impactful that is to really changing the outcomes of things. And that's one of the hardest conversations. I mentioned APS is a relatively small and flat organization. Product development is actually, I would say, it was one of our weaker things. We kind of have an intuitive sense of what works, and we work very closely with the community and through our editorial representatives and other kinds of things. So we're able to sort of shape things that way, and like I said, we always come at it from the user perspective, or we try to at least, and that's really what drives us. It's not so much are we going to make money out of it, or are we going to do whatever, it's what will serve the community best, and that's what we try and keep focus on, and to the extent that if we were to commoditize away, switch to commoditized things, if it looks generic, we're worried about losing something like that. That sense of community is actually fundamental to who we are. And I think that's one of the conversations that we keep coming back to, right? How much do we have to distinguish ourselves? Our website is a very clean design. We don't put industry logos all over the place and things like that. But people appreciate that when we go and talk to them. But there are these trade-offs, right? And so it's a constant struggle. And I think the important thing is that as Stewart was saying, is that it is a constant struggle, and you need to be thinking about it, right? You need to be stepping back and trying to assess, is this the right thing for us to be doing 5 years? Just because we did it 5 years ago doesn't mean that today it's the right thing. Looking to the future and capabilities building and things like that. One of the advantages we have is that we are sort of narrowly focused on the scholarly communication side, on the journal sides of things. We don't have a book program, for instance. So it means that we can focus on doing something very well for our community, embedded in the community. And we treat that as a competitive advantage. And so we worry about giving that up. But it's still questions that we always have to ask. And we're always looking for business partners across the organization to help us navigate through those issues.
I'll make 2 quick points to that. One, the tension between product management and technology, or product management and sales, it's a healthy one. I don't think they need to agree on everything. I think as a culture, you need to enable a good tension so that both parties are a bit displeased. It's a good thing. The second one, in terms of identifying whether it's a commodity or competitiveness, if you don't mind, I just want to share an example outside of the industry. Netflix At one point, known for their engineering prowess, that they can build everything better than anyone else. In fact, they were monopoly in streaming at one point. And there was an internal debate about, what do you do about their cloud infrastructure, right? And as you know, there are other large players. They decided they're going to build their own hardware. They're going to build their own cloud infrastructure. And this was a huge internal debate. And finally, they decided to go with Amazon. And today, they're the largest Amazon customer in terms of capacity and all of that, right? But what it did is it wasn't an isolated technology decision. If it was, I think the answer was staring in their face, that they should actually build it, they could do it better. But it was part of their entire strategy in terms of what business do they want to be in. In contrast, a company, a large pharma company I used to work for, which you can find out, they, 2008, where AWS wasn't the darling of the world back then, they weren't quite where they need to be, and we had a phenomenal internal data center talent, right? And they were actually better in many ways when you technically compare it. So the question actually, the debate that happened, could we do it better? They could do it better. Actually, it shifted to should we do it? Should we do it? If our mission is to create a healthier world and actually, impact people's life, it doesn't matter we are great at a data center. It's not going to matter 10 years from now. AWS may be behind now, but they're going to catch up so fast. It doesn't make sense. That's a healthy conversation to have. Just because you can do it better today, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to do it.
Yeah, I think part of it's cultural again, that I think you have to be willing, the organization has to be willing to challenge all the sacred cows every time they come up.
Yeah.
Never put something aside, say, oh no, that's how we do it.
Right.
You have to look and say, no, we do that, why? And what's the future? Is it still competitive? If it's not, it's a commodity. There's no in between there. You're getting competitive advantage or you're not, and because you got it 5 years ago doesn't mean you're going to get it now or in 5 years. But it's a cultural shift.
Yeah. So I've got a related question for Jim and Stewart mainly, but could appreciate a reply from all. How did you get stakeholder buy-in to support tolerance for failure? So I'll answer this one first. So to me, this is actually this is a hard leadership responsibility, and for me, there's really two kind of sides to this. One is that it's important for me to demonstrate to others, particularly those that are in my organisation, that I'm learning, that I'm making risks, that I'm taking risks, and that I'm failing, and that I'm learning from them, to essentially really create the environment where there is some degree of safety. And I was actually started off as an architect within the organisation, so I've actually written a lot of the core plumbing code. And a lot of that plumbing code is aged pretty well, and some of it is not aged well at all. And so, and Neil's laughing, he knows. So I actually use opportunities in the tech events in particular to essentially call that out and just kind of acknowledge, what were the thought patterns that went into that, like to take people on the journey with me. But the other side of this is in terms of, particularly making technology mistakes. The bottom line is that while I can have conversations and try and get alignment that we're kind of prototyping and all this sort of stuff, basically I have to suck it up. My calculus is, what's my political capital? And your job as a leader is not just to accumulate political capital. You also have to spend political capital. And things don't always go right. And what I need to do is essentially take whatever knocks I'm going to give and have the people be absolutely fine and feel like they've learnt through it, and that it's a really important strategic capability that we have to be able to make those mistakes.
I agree with that. And other thing, you have to make sure that the people who are part of accepting a tolerance for risk have to understand that the difference between tolerance for failure and incompetence.
Yes.
It's a real, we have a high tolerance for failure. We fail all the time. It's not really the answer. The answer is we fail and we recover and then we move on. And the leader does have to end up taking the beating.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. That's not one of my personal challenges. I've actually had to learn to really
hard.
Be much more gracious and really give people the opportunity to really demonstrate that they did actually have competence in the process.
It's interesting that, I would say, yes, you can wait to get stakeholder buy-in. It'll be a long journey, but I think whoever you are and whatever your roles are, you can demonstrate it very, very easily, organically. The moment the team start talking about, here's what I learned, not necessarily here's where we failed, here's what I learned, and we want to share it, it's incredible, how quickly it sort of amplifies,
Yeah, when the people around you, especially your staff, start seeing that there's not necessarily long-term ramifications to your career because you've failed,
Yeah.
they're willing to risk.
All right, well, we are coming up on time. We had a lot of great questions flow in. So while nobody actually got a microphone, I really appreciate that you had a lot of questions here. We unfortunately didn't get time to answer them all, but thank you very much. And I believe we now have a 20-minute break. Paige is coming up to do the transition.